All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the St. Paul Area Association of Realtors Book Club author event. My name is Simon Opatz, and today I'm introducing our speaker, Bill Fulton. Bill Fulton is one of the nation's leading thinkers on urban planning and land use. He currently serves as a senior advisor to PFM Management and Budget Consulting Group, is a fellow at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation, and at UC Berkeley, and an adjunct assistant professor at the LBJ School. From 2014 to 2022, Bill served as director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University in Houston. He trained in land use planning at UCLA. Bill previously served as planning director for the city of San Diego and mayor and city council member for the city of Ventura, California. Bill's first career was as a journalist, specializing in writing about cities and urban issues. In his career, has also served as president and CEO of Solomar Research Group, land use think tank, principal in the California-based urban planning firm now called Placeworks, and vice president for policy and implementation at the advocacy group Smart Growth America, based in Washington, D.C. His expertise includes transfer of development rights, the role of land use regulation and housing production, the structure and organization of local government, and equitable economic development. He's the author of Guide to California Planning, the standard land use planning textbook in California, which is now in its 6th edition. His 8th book, Place and Prosperity, How Cities Help Us Connect and Innovate, was recently published by Island Press and is the book he will be talking about with us today. And thank you for joining us here today, Bill, and I'll pass it along to you.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen in a minute and I'll do a little talk and then we can have a Q&A. I do want to say,
you guys turn it on. Turn it down.
My career has gone back and forth between doing things about cities and writing about them and squeezing in writing and squeezing in books. I had been thinking of doing a collection of essays called Place and Prosperity for some time. At the beginning of COVID, as we all did, all of a sudden I had more time, right? I wasn't commuting, I wasn't traveling to meetings, I wasn't traveling for work. And so I started to write more. And in particular, I wrote the lead essay in Place and Prosperity, which is about my hometown, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And I talked, and that was a way to get into the topic of how both sense of place and economic development and economic growth help cities help people. So so I could tell this story in a lot of different ways, but I've chosen here to tell the story in a somewhat personal manner. And so I'm going to share my screen now and whoops, there we go. Everybody can see that, right? I want to point out what it says there at the bottom, which is that if you buy the book directly from Island Press and you use the discount code Fulton, you get a discount. So the book is called Place and Prosperity, How Cities Help Us to Connect and Innovate. And it really is, as I said, about the relationship between our sense of place and our economic development and prosperity, which is so often grounded in cities. And I'll tell you that where I started to think about this, as Simon said, I was trained as a land use planner at UCLA. So I've done most of my work in my career about urban planning and land use. But quite a few years ago, I started writing for Governing Magazine. And if you are involved in state or local government, you probably know Governing Magazine has been for many years it's now totally online, but it has been the leading magazine for state and local government around the country. And they got me, my job was to write about economic development and how states and local government pursued economic development policy. And the way that manifested itself was I tended to write about the latest big trend in economic development, whether that was a stadium like Sophie Stadium, a convention center like the Las Vegas Convention Center, an auto assembly plant like this one outside of Chattanooga. Whatever the latest big fad was in economic development, my job was to write about it and say it's not a panacea, and say it doesn't solve all problems. But as I with my background as an urban planner, writing about economic development, I began to think about this relationship between place and prosperity, and how cities are really grounded in the whole idea. I'll go into this a little bit of as being centers of commerce, and how place and prosperity often go together. And that led me to start thinking about my own upbringing in my hometown and what that experience said to me and how it shaped me as an urbanist. This picture is obviously a little bit before my time, but this is a picture of the downtown in my hometown, probably about 1945, Auburn, New York, which is in the Finger Lakes near Cornell, a little factory town. And I'm going to show you some more stuff in telling you this story. But this was very much the experience that I had as a kid. This was a city of 30,000 people. And as I say in the book, everything happened in the downtown. Even Pepsi-Cola advertisements happened in the downtown. But every store my mother shopped at was in the downtown. Every doctor I ever went to was in one of those upper stories. And everything revolved around the downtown. And this was my experience as a kid. This picture probably was taken when I was a kid. I remember the WT Grant Company. I even remember the Pepsi-Cola thing on top of it. So it was a very, very tight-knit little town, as you can see, built mostly in the 19th century, 3 square miles by 2, 30,000 people, everything in it completely self-contained when I was a kid, not so much now. But it was a long time, so I absorbed that as a kid, but it was a long time that before I began to understand that a vibrant place was often the result of and interconnected with local prosperity. I didn't even think about this in my own family, but this was the biggest factory in my hometown when I was a kid. This was the Colombian Rope Company, the second largest rope company in the world, a beautiful manufacturing building, as you can see. So created a strong sense of place, but also was the basis of prosperity in our town. Even making the rope had its own kind of beauty, as you can see from these pictures. The rope, actually, the twine went all the way around the building in the process of being made into rope. It started at one end, went all the way around in a square to the other. It had its own R&D lab in the, very sophisticated chemists in this very small town who had mostly gone to Cornell, and including my grandfather, who was the founder of the lab. And so when I began to reflect on my own family's history, I realized that even the prosperity of my own family was rooted in this place, very much in this place that I grew up in, where the town and the assets of the town were interconnected with with then the factories and the associated R&D labs. And I never really made the connection between place and prosperity until much later in life, when I would drive around upstate New York, where I grew up. I lived most of my adult life in California, and I live in Texas now, but I obviously grew up in upstate New York. I never really made the connection till later in life, when I noticed in upstate New York, particularly in smaller cities of 10,000 people or less, everywhere you saw a lovely downtown, and this is green New York, everywhere you saw a lovely downtown, you saw a prosperous factory on the edge of the town. This is also green New York. This is the Raymond Corporation. This is the headquarters of the Raymond Corporation, which makes forklifts, a very prosperous company located in this tiny little town. And one of the things I observed was when the downtown was crap, the factory on the edge of the city was empty. When the downtown was in good shape, you always had a factory like this on the edge. And I saw this over and over again, and it never really dawned on me until later in life. So what happened in this tight little town of mine, and how did that affect my thinking about an urbanist? It was, as you can see, it was a very beautiful, tight little town. Well, what happened was this. Back in the 70s, using federal money, the city demolished half the downtown for urban renewal. And at the same time, the state, using federal money, decided to build an arterial road through the town 1 block away. So by the time I was a teenager, the beautiful little downtown I grew up with look like this. You can see the loop road and the arterial road, and you can see basically half the downtown is gone. And I tell the story in the book about, let me see what the next is. So one of the things I realized a few years ago was I had experienced a kind of urban renewal PTSD as a kid, that this was the most beloved building in the downtown being demolished in 1975. But I tell the story in the book, and I mentioned that the lead essay in the book is about my hometown. When I was about 18 years old, I was a cub intern reporter for the local newspaper, and I was going to cover my first city council meeting. And I was very excited, 18 years old, and I walked from the newspaper building, which is I don't know if you can, which was here, to the city hall, which was here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, about 3 or 4 blocks, and I stepped out of the building, and it felt like I was in a war zone, right? Because all this construction is going on, things are being torn down, and I got to the city hall, and they were having an urban renewal meeting to talk about what to do with the prime parcel of land that they had developed that as a result of tearing down buildings, which was here. This was what they considered the prime parcel of land. And during the course of the meeting, at the age of 18, I figured out they didn't have a developer interested in building anything in this location. The market in upstate New York was weak. They didn't have anything. Finally, they got a supermarket. They were thrilled just to get a supermarket, which, as it turns out, 50 years later, is still there. Was a Wegmans supermarket, which in the Northeast is now a luxury supermarket and very desirable. But it made me realize, number one, my hometown had been kind of destroyed for no reason. And number two, they really didn't know what to do next because they didn't expect that there wasn't going to be a market. So what did I do as a result of this? Well, I moved as far away as possible to a place that didn't seem very urban to me, this is obviously Los Angeles, right? And this is where I moved to from my hometown. And I was a bit alienated by it because it doesn't seem very urban. But then but it is prosperous. And especially in those days when I moved there, it was prosperous in the 80s. And over time, I realized it actually has really great urban bones. For a variety of reasons that I can go into if you want. Los Angeles has a lot of really great small suburban downtowns. The two most obvious, popular of which are Pasadena. This is downtown Pasadena, California. And of course, Santa Monica. This is 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica, both of which are very famous now. And so eventually I settled in the town of Ventura, which is 60 miles away from Los Angeles, near Santa Barbara on the coast, where I eventually became mayor. But again, another small city with a good downtown and host to a prosperous company. If you look down at the bottom of this picture, that's the corporate headquarters of Patagonia, which is about 3 blocks from this location. And if you want to see why Patagonia is based in Ventura, you only got to look at the top of the picture, because that is where Yvon Chouinard loved to surf, which is why Patagonia is where it is. So Patagonia came in, built up a huge company, very successful, a $3 billion company, and renovated old industrial buildings adjacent to the downtown. So again, as I got older and more sophisticated, that reinforced to me this relationship between place and prosperity. And I came to realize something that I should have learned in planning school at UCLA, which I kind of learned, but I forgot, which is that the most basic reason cities exist is to bring people together in close proximity to one another, and not just to live good lives, which is what we urban planners always think it's about, but also, most important, to facilitate commerce. And I also saw, after I moved to California, that other people's urban PTSD actually can be healed. This is the anybody know where this is? This is the old Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco. In the middle here is the ferry building. This is where all the ferries come in. And in the 1950s, this freeway was built, and it separated as happened in so many cities, it separated the waterfront along the bay from the rest of the downtown. It was and then in 1989, there was an earthquake, the Loma Prieta earthquake, which actually destroyed this freeway, and they never rebuilt it in San Francisco. And this is what it looks. They built a boulevard instead, and this is what it looks like today. So it made me realize that it is possible. After I moved to California, it is possible to heal from your urban PTSD of the actions of the 60s and 70s to something that is more humane. Of course, then I went and moved to Houston, a city with no zoning. And this is, I will say, not everybody has a roller coaster in their backyard in Houston, but with no zoning, it's possible. And this, I have to say, this city challenged me. Houston challenged me more than any other city that I've ever experienced in the relationship between place and prosperity. It certainly didn't seem, this Houston's a prosperous place. It didn't seem to me like it was a place with a strong sense of place. And it certainly wasn't a very accommodating place for pedestrians. This is an actual picture of an actual sign put up by Rice University near their campus. I haven't seen any signs that say, observe traffic signals, watch out for pedestrians. But this is all over the campus at Rice. But, you know, the longer I lived in Houston, and I've lived there for 8 years now, I've begun to see that even there, people love to be together and that place matters a lot. This is Buffalo Bayou Park, adjacent to downtown Houston. So I think one of the important points to make is that not all good places are prosperous, and not all prosperous places are well designed. But you can still make, but they still go together. A place that is prosperous will have a location, that a city that is prosperous should and will create good places, and good places will lay the foundation for prosperity. And just to give you an example, this is another shot from my hometown in the 1960s when I was a kid. And I'll show you, this is from a different angle, but this is the same intersection today. Auburn has a large state prison, so somebody created a brewery called Prison City Brewery, which is now one of the renowned breweries in New York State. And this part of downtown, the part that did not get torn down, is really prosperous. So that's really interesting to see. And I have to say, after being all over the country and all over the world, not all over the world, but in lots of different places of the world, Main Street in Ventura still is my favorite street. And it really shows you what place and prosperity can do when you go together. And it shows you what role a great place can play. I've seen the whole downtown shut down in order to welcome home a hometown boy. I've seen downtown shut down for a St. Patrick's Day parade. This was our beloved inflatable green pig, which was called Sham Hawk. And one day, actually, in the middle of the parade, in front of the reviewing stand, Sham Hawk deflated, and they actually buried him. And now there's a different one. And during COVID, this same town, as the same street, as is so often the case in so many different cities, reinvented itself as a center of both place and prosperity. They shut off the road, created outdoor dining up and down Main Street, and that is now permanently closed for that purpose. And so, you know, I didn't want to go on too long, and thank goodness that I didn't, but I think the point I want to make is how cities help us connect and innovate. It really takes a strong set of places that can bring people together to create prosperity, but also it requires prosperity to create great places. You know, I coincidentally, as I'm participating in this, in my consulting life, I am working to respond to a request for proposal from the St. Paul Downtown Alliance, which wants to do a new downtown strategy. And so I'm thinking a lot about downtown St. Paul right now and the place values it has and how those can be reinforced and reunited in order to encourage more prosperity in downtown St. Paul and St. Paul generally. So that's really all I wanted to say, but I chose to say this in a very personal way. There's lots of other things in the book that we can talk about. I talk a little bit about my elected life. There is a section about California and Los Angeles, but the main parts of the section, one section is about place, and one section is about prosperity and economic development. So that's the book. This is how you get it. You can also buy it on Amazon, although I make less money if you do that. I'd be happy to, thanks for inviting me, and I'd be happy to talk more and answer any questions up until around the top of the hour.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bill, for all of that and for joining us today.
I'll stop sharing now.
Sure. Well, to those of you who are on the call, do any of you have any questions for Bill? I hope so, but I got a couple backup ones in case
or even comments or your own stories.
Yeah. I see Harrison has his hand raised. Harrison, why don't you ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for your presentation, Bill. It was pretty insightful. I'm zooming in from Trenton, New Jersey, which is, as I'm sure you're aware, being from the Northeast region, is, or at least I won't say historically, but is, recently not the most prosperous place.
Right.
And one of the things that I'm interested in terms of this idea of prosperity and perhaps building up prosperity in less prosperous places is to sort of bring context to this question. I'm an ecologist or a PhD student studying ecology, and I'm sort of wondering the role of, renaturalizing or increasing the ecology of urban spaces, what role that might play in terms of increasing the prosperity of less prosperous cities.
That's a good question, Harrison. And I have thought about, I'm familiar with Trenton, obviously, which has struggled with prosperity, even though it's the state capital, for a long time. And I remember I'm many times going through on the Amtrak and seeing that bridge with the big sign that says, Trenton makes, the world takes, right? Which is, kind of celebrating Trenton as a manufacturing city. Well, I would make a couple of points about renaturalization, particularly in older communities that are legacy communities that are losing population. One is for almost any kind of real estate development, and not just residential, but even office development, one of the most important ways, if you are seeking economic success, to maximize the value of your real estate investment, is to locate it next to a park. I have a friend who was a real estate investor for a long time, and he invested in office buildings, and he had this whole algorithm which resulted in him only ever buying office buildings that were adjacent to a park. So there's no question that people value natural spaces, and we saw that during COVID. I will say one of the wonderful things about legacy cities that have lost population is that you begin to have more opportunity to renaturalize and to create more parks and open space that people can take advantage of. You've seen Cleveland do that. And I think that, that requires investment. That probably requires public investment or philanthropic investment, because there's no private sector payoff on that. But I think there's no question that renaturalization and expanding green space, particularly in legacy cities, can help increase the attractiveness. There are other obstacles. In a place like Trenton, it's probably misplaced fear of crime, but also just the longstanding habit of believing that it wasn't any good, right?
Right.
Equally true of a place like Camden. But a beautiful place, or a prettier place, or a place that is more naturalized definitely has that potential. Other questions or comments? Or Simon, go ahead and jump in.
Paige, please ask your question.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, Bill. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I have a comment, and I think I have a question after the comment. But I was in Orlando recently at a convention, and the convention area itself, and I don't know if you're familiar with Orlando, and I imagine this is true of a lot of convention areas in big cities. But the scale of it was so inhumane. And I was walking around late one night, nobody was on the street. And it felt like post-apocalyptic just because of the immense scale of the buildings. And then we went to, I think it's College Park, which is a residential area about 30 minutes away. Where everything, charming, retail streets and beautiful homes, and everything was really human scaled, which really increased just how you felt. I mean, it just changed how you felt in the area. And when we read your book and had the book club, somebody in the group commented on just how important the human scale of the built environment is in terms of bringing people together outside and naturally, and walkability and all of that. My question is, do you have any examples of cities or towns? I think the images you showed were really helpful when you were speaking, especially the San Francisco one, the Embarcadero with the, huge interstate or whatever that then was destroyed during an earthquake. And you can just see that then it became a little more human scaled with the boulevard. But any examples where cities or towns have intentionally kind of gone back and tried to redo what happened in the 60s and 70s and just make things more human scaled?
I think what is a couple of things. I think one is that human places that are already human scale, but were down on their heels in the 70s and 80s have come back, like little downtowns. Little downtowns have really come back and are competitive with malls. During the Great Recession, when I was mayor of Ventura, our downtown outperformed our mall in terms of retail sales and sales tax. A more difficult problem that you identify is, what if you have a massive scale thing that you're trying to put into an urban location, right? Convention centers are a particular problem because they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where I can remember when I was on the city council, we used to go to the shopping center conference in Las Vegas every year, which was at the Las Vegas Convention Center. And I would literally for 4 days not go outdoors because the hotel was connected to the convention center. What used to be the Las Vegas Hilton, if any of you know that. So convention centers are a real problem, even in San Diego, which I think has the best humane entertainment neighborhood immediately adjacent to the convention center. If you've been there, the Gas Lamp, you still have to come out of this gigantic convention center or these gigantic hotels and cross this huge street to get to the entertainment district. One type of facility that we've done a much better job of putting in locations like that is stadiums, and especially baseball stadiums. And again, I would use San Diego as an example, although it's not the only one. Certainly the ballpark in San Francisco is another example. Football stadiums are a problem, however. Nashville put their Titans stadium immediately adjacent to the downtown on the theory that the downtown and the stadium would play off of each other, but the stadium's only used 10 times a year. The only thing anybody who goes to the football game wants to do before or after is tailgate in the parking lot, and the rest of the week they use it for overflow parking for downtown with a connector shuttle. So it's very, you can take something, a relatively small scale thing like a ballpark or say an arena, and you can plop it in the middle of a downtown and you can surround it with other stuff pasted on the side of the thing. But a convention center is a real problem.
Sarah, I see your hand is raised.
Just commenting off of what you just said, because that is Minneapolis in a nutshell. I mean, we have the Twins, the Gophers, the Vikings, and the Timberwolves all playing within like 5 square miles of each other. And I used to work downtown. This was before COVID, where there were those places and there were businesses. And once the businesses closed, like when the football players were in town, the only place they had to go was Barnes and Noble or a bar. And like there was nothing else. I met a lot of famous people, made a fool of myself several times.
I'm trying to imagine football players in a Barnes and Noble, but
it was awkward. I will tell you that much. I made a fool of myself many times. So all my SPAAR friends, if you ever have time, I will tell you very funny stories. But that is totally what our downtown is they put all of that in there because it's a central location. But then when nobody's playing,
right, nothing's there. And that is a big problem now. That is a problem. And you see, even in San Diego, which is one of my favorite examples, as I said, of a ballpark that fits into the urban environment. It's incredibly vibrant on 80 nights a year, and the rest of the time it's kind of dead. Ideally, what you would see is, this is why I think for a downtown, an arena is a better bet, because it may have a basketball and or a hockey team, but it also can be used for concerts and other events or trade shows. And so you can actually use it almost every day or every night.
And they do that downtown for sure. Concerts are in all those places. It stinks too, because they're not very good for concerts. The sound just like, I remember going to the Metrodome and the sound would just like bounce off of everything,
Well, that brings up the whole question of 60s and 70s multi-purpose stadiums, domed stadiums, and how awful they were. Even though in Houston, where I live, the Astrodome is remembered in a beloved way, it was probably a terrible place to be inside. Megan, right? Simon, Megan's got her hand up. Thank you for showing such good Zoom etiquette and raising your hand. How unusual this is.
We learned that in our book club. Thank you, Simon. So thanks again for the book. And I know we all really enjoyed it. My question is, knowing you've been mayor and then you've also have this urban revitalization background, if a person like me has an idea of what I would like, let's say downtown St. Paul, as they're coming up with a plan to revitalize it to look like, what is the best way for us to voice our opinions from your political standpoint?
And it is funny, because one of the things that in working on this proposal today, and in fact, I'm in Berkeley right now, and I have a meeting right after this with one of my colleagues to discuss that. It's very hard to influence as an individual. It's much easier to influence as a part of a group that has an identifiable concern. So for example, in this proposal, I hope I'm not telling any tales out of school. I don't think I am. In this proposal we're doing for downtown St. Paul, we're saying the Downtown Alliance has to engage representatives or stakeholders that represent all activities downtown, right? Not just Ecolab and the city and the county and the Met Council, but small businesses which have gotten hammered in downtown St. Paul during COVID, right? Small property owners, homeless service providers have to be part of the discussion. Residents and people who work downtown have to be part of the discussion. So I think the best thing to do is either hook up with some group or organize some group, friends of the whatever. I hate to say this, but our whole political system, even at the local level, is set up for elected officials to respond to pressure from interest groups. That's plural. It's destructive single issue politics at its worst, but it's constructive pluralism at its best. And that's what I would say would be the best way to do it. Find like-minded people, gather together with them, and either join or influence or create a group to participate.
So I have a somewhat similar question, and unfortunately, I think the answer is the same that you just gave, but I'll ask it anyway. So you obviously have a lot of government experience, and here in the St. Paul area, we have quite a few projects that, if they were, approved and actually got to happen, would make the city awesome. But those things are not getting approved. I'm thinking of one in particular where the county and the city are, bickering back and forth about, oh, we want 2,100 units. Oh, we want 1,800 units. And so I guess I just have a question for you. How can we kind of cut through that bickering and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good?
Yeah, that can be a huge problem. Also, I see Paul Lewis on this call. Hello, Paul, who knows more about local government than I do and practically anyone that I know. But one of the unfortunate things about our very fragmented local government system, there's a lot of good things about it, but one of the unfortunate things is local government agencies can have long-standing animosity toward each other, which long outlasts the reason for the animosity, right? And in part, yes, the answer is the same answer as before, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think in part also it's finding the elected officials who know how to make those connections, right? And who know how to cut through that. When one of your county commissioners is the mother of your mayor, right? You would think the city and the county would get along. But so you got to find ways for that. For oftentimes it's an individual connection between that overcomes that. Back to the point I made in the previous answer to Megan, I would say that the story of the YIMBY movement in California is a very powerful story. That NIMBYs were controlling the entire state. NIMBYs were able to shoot down just about any development project in any city where they were powerful. And a whole new generation of activists came along with a different perspective and a different point of view. And they managed to gain, particularly in the Bay Area. And did you in your book group, have you read Golden Gates by Connor Doherty? You got to do it. I don't care whether it's in your book group or not. You got to read that book.
Okay.
That's the story of the rise of the YIMBY movement in the Bay Area, and it really does show that a new generation of people not tethered to the old ideas, who have a different perspective, if they band together and they are vocal enough, they can change the trajectory of the entire thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, the city I was referring to was not the city where there's a familial relationship with the county. So yeah. God, what was my follow-up going to be? I had a follow-up question to that. Oh, they actually, in that city, they ran a joint campaign, a mayor and 3 council members, ran together basically to basically try and get this project approved. Unfortunately, not all of them won. Only 2 of them.
Not all of them were elected.
Yeah, I think only 2 of them were, but we'll see if that's enough or not.
Interesting.
Paul, please.
Thank you.
Great
And,
that you have this book.
Thanks, Bill. It's very nice to see you again. And I've got a couple of your previous books on the shelf behind me, and I'm looking forward to getting this one as well.
Yeah, but Paul, it's on blur, so we can't see the titles in the background.
Yeah, well, that's intentional because there might be some embarrassing ones too, I think. I found out recently, speaking of hometowns, that I'm from the same hometown in New Jersey that Richard Florida is from. So, which actually does not have a tremendous sense of place because it's a small suburb in the huge interconnected North Jersey region. But
which town, just out of curiosity, which town is that?
North Arlington. It's
North
about,
Arlington.
it's about 1.5 mile long by the same amount wide. So, but it kind of leads me to a question about the link between place and prosperity. And I'm very sympathetic, of course, to your argument. And I'd certainly go along that there's probably a strong correlation between places that are good places and places that are prosperous in a commercial industrial way. But I'm trying to think in the language of that some social scientists use about whether one factor is necessary and sufficient for another factor. And it seems like being a good place is neither necessary nor sufficient to being prosperous, because there are some prosperous places that are pretty terrible.
There are plenty of
places,
ugly,
right? Which including like much of Silicon Valley and suburban Route 128 Boston and places around here in suburban Phoenix where I live, some of them. But in the other direction, do you need prosperity in order to have a good place? It's not sufficient because there are prosperous places that are not good places to live, but it may be necessary, right? So I'm trying to think of, you mentioned small downtowns that came back, but in the absence of general prosperity or commercial industrial prosperity generally, it's hard to think of attractive downtowns that have held on or aren't full of vacant storefronts. And there's a lot of beautiful old downtowns in Midwestern small towns, like in central southern Illinois, Indiana, and so forth, many of which have a lot of vacant shops in them, as they just don't have, those factories have closed. Or Trenton, which our colleague talked about earlier, which I'm familiar with too. And there's some great bones there, but the Roebling plant closed, and the prosperity other than the state government is not so much there anymore. So it seems like you need the prosperity to make the good place, but you don't necessarily need the good place to make prosperity, unfortunately.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that, Paul. There's no question that you need prosperity to create good places. I would say the secret to creating a great city is pretty simple. You just take as much money as you can and stuff it in as small a space as you can for as long as you can. And you'll get a great city every time. Look at London, look at Paris, look at New York, look at Tokyo, which is why I always say Las Vegas is going to be one of the great cities of the 23rd century, because there's just going to be there's so much money thrown into this small area that eventually, it's beginning to emerge as a good urban place. But you're right that place is not a necessary and sufficient precondition for prosperity, and there are plenty of ugly, prosperous places. I live in one of them, or what was historically one of them. But what's interesting is that and many beautiful downtowns are in decline. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to make about 2 points. One is, yes, it requires prosperity at some point in the place's history to create a good place, right? I can remember going to Scranton once, and it was clear to me that during the coal mining era, which was relatively brief, what had happened was the people who controlled Scranton had taken all the wealth down, dug it all up from the ground, and piled it up on the street, right? It had great old bones, but it was run down. But at the same time, and gentrification is a good example of this, when new prosperity looks for a place to go, it often goes to good places. and those places come back. I mean, you look at Brooklyn, you look at Oakland, you look at San Francisco. So yeah, you're right. You don't need place to create prosperity. You do need prosperity to create place. But over multiple generations, I think they intertwine more. And Sarah's got her hand up again.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Because it's related to what you've just been talking about. Do we need to redefine prosperity then if it's only economic and financial? Like we were talking about earlier with the inhumane big convention centers, like that's prosperous.
Yes.
But no one, it's not enjoyable. No one wants to be there. So I guess when I think of prosperity, I think of more than just financial or economic prosperity.
Well, I think economic prosperity is the foundation for other kinds of prosperity. And I would say the biggest concern today, which I do talk about at the end of the book, is that prosperity is increasingly concentrated in a few places, both in the country and within each metropolitan area. And so how do you spread that prosperity out? Why is it that whether you like downtown Minneapolis or not, why has it gotten an incredible amount of investment over the last umpteen years and downtown St. Paul has not? Sarah.
I was just curious, excuse me, about your comment about Vegas, that it's going to become very prosperous, right? And I think one of the reasons that everybody's inside, please stop, my son is sitting next to me, is that one, it's so hot. It's extremely hot, but two, it's hot because they took away all the foliage, right? And now the water is going away as well. So at some point, are people going to start migrating inwards to off the coasts or out of the deserts when you suddenly have no more water?
I don't think there's any question but that climate change will redistribute in the long run, and I don't know how long the long run is. Climate change will redistribute the population away from places like that, more toward places like where you are. Your climate will become milder. Your climate will become milder in the winter, which will be attractive. It'll become hotter in the summer. I still own a little cottage in the Adirondacks that my parents owned in upstate New York, and certainly no one ever thought of air conditioning when I was younger, but I got to put it in, right? But nevertheless, I think you're going to see, and that may in the Midwest and the Northeast, I think you'll see a revival partly because there are so many good ignored places, and there probably will be in the long run. But as I say, I don't know what the long run is. A movement toward those places.
Yeah, I have a running joke that everybody, when white people came to the country, they hit the Mississippi and they were like, nope, not crossing that. Then they came from the other side and hit the Rockies and was like, not going over that. So that strip in between is pretty minimal. But now that we have the ability to get over both of those, I feel like it's going to start coming inward over the next 50 to 100 years.
I think it's probably beyond anybody's lifetime on this call, mostly. But yes, I think that is going to happen. Maybe not everybody on this call, but certainly many of us. Any other?
Yeah, we just have a few more minutes. One thing I wanted to ask you about, first, does anyone else have any other questions? Paula, you just came off mute. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I couldn't find my little hand raiser. Sorry about that.
No problem. Go right ahead.
In this discussion about prosperity, I've spent the last 40 years working for developers on very large mixed-use urban projects where they're usually brownfields. Mm-hmm. And what I do know for certain is that if you do it right and you pay attention to creating a great place, for instance, I just had a developer on TV a couple of weeks ago say that of 100 properties, and we worked on 3 of them on the placemaking, they represent 20% of the company's revenue and generate 60% more rent. Hmm. And the thing I'm proudest about is that it diversified the community. And it was just piece of land that couldn't have been dirtier. It took 20 years to clean up, but that's where the prosperity is somebody who has the wherewithal to go through that process.
Yeah, I think all of the things being equal, it's been pretty well proven that a good place will, all of the things being equal, not including, say, an extractive economy, something like that, like they have in North Dakota, good places will probably outperform lousy places, right? All other things being equal.
And
But
I was
Simon,
thinking too, another example for your Embarcadero is here in Seattle, they just took down the viaduct that had been there.
right.
And I walked it last weekend and I was just knocked out. It's not even completed at how many people were on the waterfront. And so those are the positive aspects, I think.
I think you're gonna see, certainly Buttigieg in the Biden administration is emphasizing that. And I know in Syracuse, near where I grew up, they're going to take down the I-81 viaduct. They're talking about that on some level in most cities. Simon, looks like you get the last question.
Yeah. So one thing we talk about occasionally at SPAAR is walkability.
Mm-hmm.
And you touched on it briefly with that pretty awful sign on the Rice University campus.
Most walkable place in all of Houston, the campus, ironically enough.
Yeah, that's not a good sign. So I want to ask you, do you have any tips, tools, or anything that you would suggest for making places more walkable, or how to get cities to make places more walkable?
Well, I should say that because I'm visually impaired, I no longer drive, so I'm a pedestrian, not by choice. And the simplest thing a city can do to make places more, well, there's two things. One is simply to enforce the traffic laws, which usually don't happen. But the other is, and this is, the new urbanists have talked about this a lot, is people who are driving don't respond to the speed limit. They respond to what the road tells them to do, right? And if the road is wide and the lights are far apart, they're going to drive fast. So in most cases, we don't need as many lanes as we do. In most cases as well, if we think about taking out old interchange, example, if you're familiar with Los Angeles, right by Union Station, the Highway 101, they're going to cover part of it, and in the process to reconnect Union Station with the rest of downtown. And as part of that, they're going to remove, I don't know, 4 or 5 off ramps and on ramps. So there are little things like bulb outs and so forth, and then there are big things like simply narrowing streets or removing streets that are or removing on ramps and off ramps that are unnecessary. But it's mostly about taming cars.
One quick follow-up. What do you think about land bridges? We have a big proposal here in the Twin Cities to do a land bridge. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about
this goes to the eternal debate over whether you want to mix pedestrians and traffic or separate them. And I'm not a dogmatic either way. In Houston, at one of our crown jewel parks, Memorial Park, we just built a land bridge over a major road in order to connect 2 parts of the park. It's a little like the conversation about skywalks, right? Which has always been very active in the Twin Cities. I think that there's probably places where it's appropriate. Particularly if you simply have to have a very wide arterial and there's no getting around that. I don't particularly think there's particularly one specific answer. Okay.
As with most things, it's context dependent, isn't it?
Right, that's right.
All right. Well, yeah, we our time is wrapped up here. So Bill, thank you again for taking the time
Thanks to all
to,
of you. My
yeah,
pleasure. Thanks for reading the book.
yeah, we really appreciate your time and all the information. So you have a good rest of your evening, and thanks everyone for showing up today.
Bye.
Thank you.